COVID has been a really weird year, and it meant not a lot of conventions going. Even the conventions I attended were really just online. So I decided to show you what the most recent online convention was like. I'm going to give you the notes on what I did, what I was up to, and then my final notes of what I think can be done to improve or otherwise. So let's go. So I attended Life, the Universe, and Everything, which is a writers' conference for sci-fi fantasy writers in Utah, which doesn't sound that big, except that a lot of the really big names in sci-fi and fantasy live in Utah. It's just one of those weird quirks. And, you attend and you just meet these random people who you think, oh, they can't be that big, and instead they're huge. And it's just one of those kind of a weird experiences. I was invited by a bunch of friends, and I attended the first time, and then discussing with other friends about it, they said, you should be a panelist. So for the last 2 years, I've been a panelist on this show. The first panel I did was a coronavirus debriefing, evaluating responses to COVID-19. So literally, it was us looking at how people responded to COVID-19. What I expected was for us to look at the statistics and then how people responded to those statistics, how they thought things through, how they were scared, how people were using fear to kind of control you into thinking in certain directions. And then, maybe looking at the social aspect. Why were people doing certain things? And the answer is that's how they think anyway. They already have this mindset of, well, bureaucracy is going to be the answer. Well, guns are going to be the answer. Well, this is going to be the answer. Not because they know what the answer is, but because they were thinking that was the answer anyway. That is something that they know how to deal with. Sort of like asking a road guy how to take care of your car. He just tells you, build better roads. It's just how he thinks. So that's what I was expecting. Instead, what I got was two people. They were actually experts in their fields, very nice people, but you could tell that they were kind of stuck in the bureaucratic system. So if it was a bunch of people going, oh, we need to not use the bureaucratic system, they were like, oh, those are fools. How dare they do these things? And we never got into the statistics. We never got to discuss how weird numbers can be when we have such a large population in such a large country. We have 330 million people in the third largest country in the world. So the numbers and the systems aren't comparable to other countries at all. The top two most populous countries are in the billions and a much smaller area. And, the first two largest countries are much smaller in population. So we are way out in this weird area in the US. So comparing numbers, you have to, not do things in the same way that others would look at it. And honestly, the greatest debates I've seen have been people who were really good at Excel and decided to look at statistics and then build everything, looking at the statistics and using statistical information to have a debate on what the best answer is. I can tell you what the best answer is, by the way. And that is, if they have certain comorbidities, if they're of a certain age, then they need to be treated completely differently from everyone else. Everyone else, honestly, should go back to work, should enjoy their life. If you have these certain things, then welcome, you are now in a socialist country. You will have to be treated very differently. Your life is now quarantine city, all of this stuff. Unfortunately, nobody came up with that answer. They either said everybody is free to do what they want, or everybody needs to be in quarantine. And then what levels of quarantine should we be in? I live in Washington, so our level of quarantine, our governor actually changed the quarantine levels to stage 1 and stage 2. And stage 2 is the highest you can go, but it only allows 25% capacity in any area, like a mall or a store or a restaurant, which means pretty much he doesn't expect COVID-19 to go away. Whereas you go to Florida, which did everything correctly. They changed all the rules based on what the possibilities of you dying of this disease are. And, they had very different results. But there is a lot of fear going on. But what I got was, oh, well, the people who are angry or aren't doing as I say, who do they think they are? And it was kind of interesting, really. I think the most interesting commentary I saw was from a woman named Anne Campanile. I think I said her name wrong. She was a phone advisor for people with disabilities. And people were calling her up to see if everything was okay. Was Donald Trump going to kill them? Was Donald Trump going to save them? Were they going to die? Was their company not going to cover them because they had these comorbidities? I mean, this is honest fear. And she had to be like, no, you're okay. You're okay. And she was the one who wanted to stay out of politics and just discuss things directly. Everyone else kind of wanted to be like, well, the answer is bureaucracy. Why? Because they're accustomed to bureaucracy. They can't handle the idea of bureaucracy not being the answer. So that's what we got a lot of from the discussion. And I kind of closed and just went, that wasn't very fun. I didn't enjoy that. So that was my experience. And it was really interesting because while doing it, I realized I needed to get a chair and I needed to, have a cool background. And I couldn't do that at the moment for that particular show because the people, or I was just already doing shows and I didn't have a chance. So my arm actually ended up getting tired at the second panel. The second game, or the second panel, was on historical settings for games, and that was a lot more interesting. I saw a lot more background people, or people with background stuff. There was a large variety of what we were going to discuss. There was a guy who really wanted to discuss Napoleonic War games. He was really into that. There were people into board games. There were video gamers. So it was a very wide variety of discussion about games we would like. This is actually from the earlier video I made where I said, oh, what games would I like to see? So, we got to discuss what games were possible. And I was like, there are certain cool things about video games because you get to experience something without having to have a full experience. How did these armies move? Well, now we have little numbers and dice to tell us. Sometimes the dice roll gets in the way, but at least we're trying. At least there's something there. So, I thought it was a great discussion. By the way, if you ever want to do research and you're like, oh, I don't know how they did such and such, we have books out there about sources where somebody goes in, finds all the sources, and then just lists them out, and quotes directly. So you don't have to go do a bunch of stuff to get that. And usually you can find them on Amazon. Just type in source or source book and then list the history or something you want, and you usually find it. If you're still having a hard time, talk to a history teacher. They usually have a lot more information than you think. So it was a pretty good thing, though I have to admit, by the end of the discussion, my arm was starting to ache, and I realized I needed to hook up a tripod to get everything to work. So that was pretty much my experience for that day. And honestly, the biggest thing I realized was I could have gone to work that day and not been bothered too much, because it was actually at 4 o'clock and I would have gotten off work at like 2 or 3 o'clock, depending on when I went to work. So I felt kind of dumb that day. But there is a lot of history out there, a lot of historical games, and I want to thank all the people who made suggestions for different historical games they'd like to see. I will make a video about that as soon as I can. But I wanted to talk about my experience at LTUE first. The next game, or sorry, the next panel was the next day, and like 11 o'clock in the morning in Utah, but it was an online panel, so I was up at 10 o'clock in the morning and talking to people. And it was an interesting discussion because it was on Japanese mythologies. And I felt a little awkward because they were like, so what's the creation story? And I was like, you do know the Japanese, right? Like, this is supposed to be a family-friendly convention, and you just asked me the creation story of Japanese mythology. Literally, the creation story is, this woman got sick and puked and pooped and peed, and that created the land around us. And then each great spirit and god created this other land based on their desires. And often there was pooping and peeing and other stuff going on. So it's not an easy discussion. Also, they were like, well, what are the great gods? And I was like, there's like millions of them. That's not how mythology really works in Japan. In the US, in Europe, we kind of have this belief that only a few things can have a soul. Like, humans and maybe your dog. But you don't believe that tree has a soul or that wooden item has a soul. And if it does, it's kind of scary. Whereas in Japan, it's like, of course that doll has a soul, that tree has a soul, that rock has a soul. And we built a little shrine for each one. And so, at least once a week, you're going to be woken up by a festival for one of the major shrines in the area. So it was a really fun discussion. I enjoyed it. It wasn't a lot of panelists, but we knew our stuff pretty well. And we just went back and forth telling stories and stuff about, being in Japan, how to learn stuff, and, just having a lot of fun. I think the most interesting commentary we had was how the Japanese treat foreigners. And the answer is they will always think of you as foreign because you look foreign. But if they think you've learned something about Japanese culture, they will hold you to it. Like if you're speaking Japanese to somebody and you use an honorific, they can hear that you can use honorifics and they will hold you to it. If you screw up, they will either tell you or they will be insulted. So that was kind of how it went. And it was a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it. If you want to learn more about Japanese mythology, really, it's on Wikipedia. Everything you need to know is there. There is a ton of it to learn because there's a couple thousand years of history here. Someone asked in the Discord about a multi-eyed god and where does this idea come from? It shows up in Studio Ghibli films. Princess Mononoke. Mononoke, by the way, is the heck was that? Mononoke is an animal spirit. So a human with an animal spirit has a different meaning in Japanese. Now that I think about it, that could be a werewolf. Huh. But Mononoke Hime is a princess who has or works with gods who are animals. And that was the entire premise of Princess Mononoke, was this human trying to talk to this other human who is actually part of the system of gods. So it was fascinating how we discussed things, and we brought up a Kurosawa film and, different ideas and places and things to research how to understand the Japanese idea of how things worked. And then somebody asked a good question. How do the Japanese take all of this? Are they going to be insulted if you use their culture? And the answer is, it doesn't bother them as much. If you're trying to show, the culture well enough, they'll forgive you. They'll be like, oh, yeah, good job. Oh my gosh. And they'll help you out as best they can. They are not going to be angry with you about any of that. But they will hold it to you if they're not from Japan. And that's more of a trying to deal with your the fact that your culture is kind of rare in an area. Like if I'm German and I look for a lot of German stuff just because I know there isn't a lot of good German cultural pushes by people. So, if I see something German, I'm like, yay, German! And, I try to really show respect to my German culture. Whereas, somebody with Japanese cultural history will try to show their Japanese cultural history. And that becomes really important to them. Whereas somebody from Japan takes it for granted because, hey, Japan is everywhere, man. So it's really not a thing for somebody in Japan. Japanese don't care. In fact, to them, culture is to be shared. And if you're not sharing it, something's wrong with you. So it was a really fascinating discussion. The next panel we discussed was Guerrilla Warfare. And there really are two types. The first is siege warfare, which you can find throughout history. And the next one is urban warfare, or the idea of using more of a clandestine opportunity. Really, when we say clandestine, we mean more like the mob. And that's how it should be viewed. So let's say I don't even know what this guy is doing right now. Bunch of stats. Metal Gear. But the debate went back and forth on which is more important, and it was an interesting discussion. I mean, we got some really good insights because, guerrilla warfare, all the ideas came from guys like Mao Zedong and his treatise on guerrilla warfare. And the idea isn't to defeat an army. It's to win the hearts and minds of the people. And with that, you win. If you get all the people convinced that you are the good guy and that everybody should be following you, then it doesn't matter what the army does. They won't trust that army. And then the army can't do things. And then each side kind of promotes this different idea. In the police, we often see police people, people in police uniform who view, a riot almost like they're looking at zombies. Whereas if you're viewing it from the point of view of the rioters and others, the police are something akin to stormtroopers from Star Wars. And when we talk about guerrilla warfare, we have to recognize that these guerrillas want you convinced of things. A lot of the times, you'll only see like one guy who's actually being paid to be there, and he's surrounding himself by people who want to be there because he recruited them. And we discussed how recruitment happens, how people prepare things, how people do things. And I was like, honestly, I saw the same thing at, the CHOP, or Chaz, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. And it was entirely because there were people who truly believed that they were doing the right thing. And then there were recruiters, people who seemed to be paid to be there or had some ulterior motive to be there. And that was a fascinating thing because we had guerrilla warfare in Seattle and in Portland. And discussing it, there's a lot of people who want to use fear and doubt and, kind of push the idea that the police are these stormtroopers. And then we have another side who's saying that these rioters are zombies attacking the people, and you have to be scared of them. And so that became a major thing. That was a fascinating discussion, and I really enjoyed it. And by that point, I had really gotten a chair ready. I had gotten stuff ready, but I realized my chair wasn't good enough, and I needed some more padding because I was sitting on this chair for hours on end, and it started to be painful. Also, I was getting kicked off on each panel that day, and I don't really know why. Just suddenly everybody froze up, and I was like, I think I've been kicked out. So I had to jump in and be like, oh, sorry, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, that was pretty much what it was like for me. And the Guerrilla Warfare was a fascinating conversation. If I get the opportunity, I am going to post all the links to the panels I did on my Facebook channel and on my Twitter account so that you can check it out. For the next panel, I actually woke up. I had a nice pad for my chair. I had everything ready because I knew it was going to be a long day. There was going to be a lot done. And I can't think of any video games that would really represent this subject, so I apologize. It's called Mother Knows Best, Structures of Matriarchal Societies, and we don't have a lot of video games with matriarchal societies, so I've done my best, sorry. If you recognize the reference I'm making, you know the joke. Anyway, I discussed matriarchal societies, and this was probably the one that got the most commentary out of people, because it's a very, very touchy subject. There's a lot of academia out there who believes that there are no matriarchal society. It's made up. Who do you think you are? The men still do what men do, so therefore, there are no matriarchal societies because men are still acting like men, and they still make decisions that a man would make. And you have to actually explain that, yes, men still do what men do, but the view of what men do is seen as less than what women want. The society will aim at women. The gods will be women. The great knowledge will come from women. The great philosophers will be women. And you can see this in the societies that actually have this. In Navajo culture, the person who gave them the great knowledge was Spider-Woman. She has absolutely no relation to Spider-Man, by the way. And she's a sacred woman, and she came from a rock called Spider Rock, which I lived near when I was on the Navajo Res. And the women learned to weave and gained great knowledge from Spider-Woman. So weaving is this very important thing. What the woman does is important. What the man does isn't. And you have to view it that way. Somebody brought up the Mo people, which I thought was fascinating, the way they act. And then we had discussions on, what different cultures there are out there. And I honestly brought up the fact that Sokka and Katara come from a matriarchal society. And we don't realize that when we're reading, when we're watching Avatar, because we're accustomed to patriarchal societies, men doing what men want. And you look at Sokka and you're like, oh man, he's acting like such a sexist jerk, until you realize it's a matriarchal society and he's actually being treated really badly. And that's the reason why he's acting so strangely, is he doesn't have any self-worth, to the point that he considers his younger sister to be above him. And he almost views her as his own mom, because that's how his culture lets him live. Yet he's the only male who can fight, defend, hunt, and do all the things that the males need to do. And so he's treated like crap. He doesn't really come into his own until he recognizes that he has importance. And it's a fascinating subject, because so many people don't recognize matriarchal societies and how they work. What they're expecting is for big, strong women to go, oh, we don't need men. We have our own culture. Warrior women. And, the thing is, there were warrior women in cultural history, but that didn't mean that it was a matriarchal society. it just meant there were warrior women. So it was a really interesting discussion. There were a lot of comments during that time, a lot of angry comments like, who does he think he is? And it was a lot more fascinating and more fun to respond to that to, than to the others. And I think I've got to give a special shout out to the moderator, El Palmer, who really, brought things in a lot better. So it was a really fun panel. And, if you ever think about, what would a matriarchal society look like, just think what the woman does is important and what the man does is unimportant. And that's pretty much the basis of everything. Men will be treated like dogs. They should be outside and they're unimportant outside. Whereas women, are in the house and they're important. So it's a lot of fun to do. So the next subject was on domesticity. Oh man, that's a hard word. Domesticity. City. Domestic. Oh, that word. But really it was normalcy. How we set up normalcy. And that was a fun subject. And it was aimed at writers. So the first thing we set up is what is normal? How do we treat normal? And normal is, what you do on a daily basis for the last three or 4 days. It only takes a little bit before you're like, oh yeah, this is my life. And if you go out and you just do something a full day, you're just doing a lot, that becomes your life, and you just have that as your life. I've had that at conventions where, I'm into a convention and that just becomes my life without even thinking about it. And it becomes kind of difficult to let it go when the show is over, because that was my life for the last 4 days. So, normal is basically just, that place you sleep, how you eat, the people you talk to, and what you do on a daily basis. And that doesn't sound too big, but we're talking about fantasy and sci-fi writers. And the question is, how do we make something surreal seem normal? And I answered with the idea of we should have the people not respond to the weird, where they just go, oh yeah, it's normal. And if it is supposed to be kind of whimsical, have kind of a straight man. Like in Harry Potter, the first person you're really seeing who looks at things from a normal point of view are the Dursleys. And they're constantly going, oh no, we're not going to allow this whimsy. We're going to be normal. Normal! And the lengths they're willing to go to stay normal. Whereas the rest of the book, it's Harry Potter, who tries really hard to understand what's going on, but he's very much so a straight man. He doesn't know what's going on, so he gets to ask the questions like, what's that? What's this? So then we can find out. And that becomes kind of an establishing and explaining things, and then having everyone around him go, oh, well, it's this. You've heard this subject, right? And it's great. Oh, man. My favorite line in Harry Potter series is when they're talking about the Deathly Hallows, and Harry and Hermione are like, we don't know what that is. We grew up in Muggle households. What is that? And Ron's like, oh, well, it's this, story tell, whatever. Don't worry about it. And Harry's response is, well, oh, you mean like Cinderella? And Ron goes, well, is that some kind of disease? Favorite line, because it kind of establishes the weirdness and also the normalness within it. And that is a compliment I've got to give J.K. Rowling, is she makes the whimsical look normal so that you can kind of take it all in. We often have this throughout sci-fi and throughout other stories where normal, we then have to, establish normal to allow a character or to allow this world to seem real. And then we have to, move the character into the story. So, it becomes this major trope where his village is destroyed And when he comes back, is he the same person? Like in The Hobbit, where, Frodo, he's not the same person anymore, and he doesn't know if he can stay there any longer. Whereas everyone else, for all the things that happened, kind of have this feeling that they can get back to normal. This desire for normal is a major theme within Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and not so much the Silmarillion, but the Silmarillion is weird in and of itself. But, there are several fantasy books that set this up. And it's become a trope where the city gets destroyed or the home gets destroyed, and the main character is thrown into this world whether they like it or not. And yeah, that's a trope, but it works. And, it establishes a story really well. So it was the most fascinating conversation. We had tons of people for that panel, and we had a lot of discussion going on the way things worked. And I really enjoyed it. And to be honest, there were only 2 questions given to the moderator to use, because it is such a weird topic and yet an important topic for writers. I got an hour-long break to eat some food and set up a better chair. And then I discussed Chinese mythology. Chinese mythology is huge. There are multiple creation stories. It was actually a lot of fun because one of the commenters was, a fellow academic and was deep into the field, and he was looking at the cross-cultural mythology and how it worked. And he talked about cosmology and how the cosmology worked, and he had fascinating insights. And then we had a girl from Hong Kong who talked about, her experiences with Hong Kong, how the mythology worked. We had a discussion on Monkey King versus Mulan, and I had to explain that Mulan, the original Mulan, wasn't actually Chinese. She was an outsider. But the story, the poem, the original poem, was actually about an attempt to take the story of Mulan and praise her within a Chinese system. So, she became this warrior princess. She went out, she fought in these wars, and the poem makes her out to be very virtuous, very Confucian within this, even though it isn't quite as Confucian as you think it is, because women aren't to fight in Confucian systems. But she did it to reverence her father. And, there's some subtle differences. If you're in that culture that no longer exists because it's now Chinese, you would be reverenced. You were like, oh, they really think nicely of us. But if you were Chinese, you'd notice some subtleties like, oh, they were surprised to find out I was a woman. Oh, I had to sneak in from this part of town to this part of town. This would not have been noticed by those people because that's not how they would think. They don't think women as warriors is an evil thing. So, it was a fascinating discussion. I was like, the Chinese want everyone to be Chinese. And there are actually 4 Chinas. There are 3 countries that are Chinese: Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China. And then there's a 4th China, where enough Chinese are in the area where they can go and live Chinese life. That's why Chinatowns and all that stuff are kind of a China away from what we call China. And a way that the Chinese work is to take another culture and slowly turn it into Chinese culture. Because of this, there are a lot of mythologies. There are multiple creation stories. There are multiple things, like there are sacred rocks in this area, and there are, sacred cosmologies, and each cosmology might be different depending on where you are. And each country might have a different story the way it's told. And each town might have a different way of telling that story. And, you can figure out how these cultures were connected to each other by the way they tell the story. So you can create a history, but you can also realize that there is a lot there. There is, mysticism or spiritual understanding the same way the Japanese understand things. There is Confucian looks at things. There are Buddhist looks at things. And there's a serious question of, is this story Buddhist? Is this story Confucian? Is this story this? And, often it's a combination, and then just who's telling it emphasizes certain things. And that's how you know who wrote it, was what is emphasized in that story. And that's it. It just goes on. And then you have like Hindu inspiration. And, I think one of the more interesting things is when they have two different religions comparing each other, and they'll have kind of a back and forth idea of what is supposed to happen. So, Confucius goes, oh, this is the system the way it should be. And then the Buddhist God shows up and is like, no, 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 it should be this way. And then Confucius is like, yeah, well, you think men and women are the same. And the God's like, yeah, watch this, and turns themselves into a man or a woman, and then back. And it just shocks Confucius. And this is actual literature you can find in Chinese culture. So there is a lot of culture to work off of. My personal favorite is Monkey King, or Journey to the West. And there's a lot of symbolism within Buddhism. Monkey King starts off as this impetuous, very animalistic, very fast-witted creature who defeats all the gods easily and gets really insulted by the way they treat him. And he has to learn, how to be kind, how not to just respond quickly to things, to make decisions slowly and to be careful and to be kind. Whereas another character is so vain that his face turns into a pig. And another character is trying to understand, wisdom, and he can't because he's actually a giant monster. And then we have a monk who is supposed to be pure, but he doesn't recognize the situations he's putting everyone else in, and he has to start recognizing it. And it goes back and forth, and it's a fascinating subject. And that's just one of multiple books. There are thousands of years of history, and it depends on when you believe China began. There are many who believe that China didn't begin until Confucianism began, because that's really when all Chinese ideology really started. So it was a fascinating subject, and I can recommend Wikipedia because it will have all the information you need for this. But holy crap, man, there's just a lot to take in, and not even and each Chinese has their own version of the stories, or may not know, will not know all the stories. So there's a lot to study there. But it is a great source for video games, for movies. I mean, the influence of Chinese mythology is huge. If you've seen anime, you've seen Monkey King, references to Monkey King. If you've seen video games, you have seen references to Monkey King by Japanese creators. It's just such a common, well-known story. You know Dragon Ball. You know JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. You know all this, but really you don't recognize what it actually is. So, Chinese mythology, man. There's just a lot. The last two panels were about game design, and it's a completely different point of view, because the previous times I talked with people, it could be about board games, it could be about video games, it could be about writing. But the last two were entirely about video game design. The question for the second to the last panel was on story versus gameplay. And the way I put it was, gameplay is your interactions with the story or with the world. Story are the walls pointing you in certain directions, are the things you can't control. And we had a debate on how things work. I pointed out that quite often people get turned off when they feel they're not in control. If there is a 3 to 4 hour cutscene, it turns you off from the game. I know a fighting game, Injustice, which is a really fun game, but some of the cutscenes will take so long that my controller will turn off before I'm able to really play. So, suddenly the fights begins and I can't do anything because my controller is turned off. That's not a good thing. And that's kind of one of those problems. How do you set it up? How do you get things ready? How do you get things to work? You have to think about it. You have to think, what is the best way for my character to feel that they're in the game, that they're making decisions? And there are some great examples of this. Half-Life 2, there's a moment where there's a gunship that's been chasing you for a long time and you've been hiding from it because you don't have any power. Suddenly you're on a really fast boat and you've got a gun and the field opens up and the gunship appears and you go, oh yeah. And suddenly the music starts to play. You didn't need any game to explain the story to you, but you understood the emotions they wanted you to have for that game. In that same game, there was a moment where Alex and Dr. Breen, one of the scientists, and they're talking to each other, and you're open to move wherever you want, and it kind of breaks the game because they start pointing at empty air, or they start looking at empty air because you're supposed to be standing there. But if you've played this game a couple times, you're like, whatever. So you're picking up boxes and throwing it at the characters, and they're not responding. And it's hilarious, but it also kind of breaks the enjoyment of the game because these characters aren't responding to you. And I did bring up the stories or the videos I've been working on the last few weeks and months on how Sony kind of really emphasizes story over gameplay a lot of the times because that's how they view games. And they make that mistake a lot of the times because they kind of want a short game for you to just play the game and then be done with it and then buy the next game. And that's how they kind of think things through. And does that work? Does it not work? Well, Sony does well, but it does mean that a lot of their games get sold for $5-10 like a year later. And I know this because that's where I got most of my collection from. These games were 5-10 years old. I bought the entire Batman Arkham series for $2 a game. Borderlands series for, I think it was $3. The Uncharted series, $3 a piece. I mean, that's just some major games, and I got them for incredibly cheap. So that's kind of the discussion we were having, where you have to have this balance. If you want a story, a heavy story game, you have to be willing to make it work within the gameplay instead of force the character to have a cutscene after cutscene after cutscene, because it's not going to help you. There's also a discussion of something called the walking simulator, and they openly talked about it, and it's kind of a joke, but the reality is movies have a walking simulator. It's where a guy walks around and he just talks to people, and then he walks around and he talks to other people, and then he walks around and he talks to other people. And this is a story you're going to see in a lot of indie movie fests. And it shows up in indie games where somebody is just, commercial, no one cares. Yeah, you can tell I just screen save off of YouTube videos. That's why I make sure to list all the YouTube videos in these videos. So sorry, that's an unskippable commercial for me. I do not promote that product. But yeah, you have to be willing to make it within the gameplay if you want the game to be played more than once. And if it's an enjoyable gameplay, people really enjoy it. And, then I talked about video game moments where the characters and things that you can't really control kind of interact with each other while you're moving around, and you have this moment that isn't entirely prescribed by the game designers, but is set up so that it can happen. Like a car crash in Grand Theft Auto, or, when I'm playing Super Mario Brothers and I'm getting a little bored and I've got enough lives, I purposefully kill myself to make my family laugh. So that's just something you consider a gameplay moment where you're just like, whatever, that was fun. The story you tell. Whereas a lot of people who see Grand Theft Auto and, Super Mario Brothers and stuff like that, they see the story elements, the cutscenes, and they only show the cutscenes, or they only show the state or the missions within Grand Theft Auto, and say that's the game. And they miss out on why people actually play the game. So, it was a fascinating subject, and I really enjoyed it. The final panel was late at night. I had just done, multiple panels that day. I was tired. My butt kind of hurt, even though I had a pad. And it was on game design. What should your aim be? And we discussed, power and stuff. And one of the first things said by one of the game designers was, listen, Unity or Unreal will just load itself onto any engine. That isn't a problem anymore. What you need to consider is what is needed for each console. And that was a good introspective, because his major complaint was people designed a game for the PS4, then released it on the Switch, and all the characters don't look right on the Switch because literally it's a smaller screen, so you can't see what's going on. You can't see all the numbers going up. So you had to really consider, what do you want to do? If it's going to be a major minutia type game, you might want to do it PC, just because you can have multiple monitors and you can see all the minutia and you can see everything working a lot better than if you were working on the Nintendo Switch, which has a smaller screen and won't let you see all those finer details a lot better. We also discussed how game designers view these consoles. The PC has kind of this two-part, the AAA part that try to push the graphics as hard as they can, and then the indie scene, which uses a lot less graphics, uses a lot less data, but there's a certain level of sameness because they're all using the same tutorials and ideas for things. But that doesn't mean that they're evil. You just got to consider what your hook is, consider what you're doing. And I came in from a cultural point of view, whereas the other two commenters were really much more into the gameplay, the game design itself. We had some guy who worked at, I was about to say Adobe, and we had a guy who just got his master's in game design. So they know their stuff, and I could talk with them, but they obviously had different perspectives. And once again, compliments to Elle Palmer for being such a great moderator. I recommended her in the little questionnaire on what I wanted. And it was a fascinating discussion because there were a lot of details we didn't think about, that you don't think about. And why are you making a game? Do you want to make money, or do you want to learn something? Like, if you want to learn the history of video games, you're going to try to make a video game for every major console. And then you're going to see, the way those consoles worked. And then how do you port a game from this console to that console? And you find out there's two different types of ports. One where you create a completely separate game, but you make it look like that game. And then another where you take the code and you alter things so that it can fit onto that new console. And they're very separate. They're very different things. And that is a major discussion at that time. Whereas today we're like, oh, well, I can port this to phone, to Switch, to PS, the PlayStation 5, PlayStation 4, Xbox, all of those, and just easily port them all over without even thinking about it. And it's no longer a question of which console or which system I should port it over. It's more of how should I adjust it to the needs of those things. And last 5 minutes I realized, we haven't discussed VR at all, and we should, and let's have that as the last bit of discussion. And L. Palmer was a little like, oh, hey. I was like, sorry, it's that way. And but what I've discovered is virtual reality has a lot of high requirements. It doesn't have a high user base. But if you're trying to make something really, interactive, experiential, then it's really nice. If something I do is I take a 360 camera through all of my conventions, and I give you the point of view of what it's like to walk through these conventions. And I spend a lot of time preparing the robot that carries the 360 camera for you to see this. And I've been told by people who've seen those videos that this is really what it's like to go through these places. And honestly, I'd like to buy a better camera and all that, but I don't have the money. I guess I should do a Kickstarter or something. But with COVID happening, that just didn't happen. I'm sorry. It's true. I was going to do a Kickstarter for it, but COVID happened, and then everything closed down. So that was kind of how it ended for me that day. And the next part of this discussion will be what I learned from this and from previous online systems. But I want to point out that if you're designing a game, a writers' conference sounds weird until you realize that we have a lot of the same ideas. We're just using them differently. What's the difference between gameplay and story play or story? It's show versus tell. Simple as that. Telling somebody is a bunch of cutscenes. Showing somebody is having a giant statue for no apparent reason in the middle of nowhere, and you want to understand that giant statue in this giant open world more. And you know what? That giant statue will probably get a lot more playthrough, or people exploring that area with that giant statue will get a lot more playthrough and a lot more views than the cutscenes that you will get in other games. So that's kind of what I realized at the end of that discussion. The honest truth is I talked a little bit too much and we went over, and I was really sorry about that. But it was a lot of fun. So yeah, I got to cover all my fields that day. Even though my butt was very sore, I was very, very happy. So what did I figure out from all these online conventions? That was the major question I had. I've actually attended a couple of other conventions, but they weren't as good. A lot of the times it felt like a podcast trying to be an event. They just had a bunch of podcasts put together, but there was no camaraderie, there was no feeling of an event going on. And literally the night before I was like, frankly, this is a podcast trying to happen. We need to, fix this problem. And, with the COVID shutdown and all that, how does a convention change? I've got to admit, LTUE did it right. They had a separate Discord for the panelists to discuss things, but there was also a Discord just for people to hang out, ask questions, do things. And especially cool was how they had the Discord open for the viewers to ask questions and interact with us. So we could get questions right as they were being asked, or we could have things happen, and we could go back in and answer any questions that people asked. Somebody asked about a multi-faced mask from Japanese that shows up a lot in Japanese lore, and I think I mentioned in this earlier. Well, the truth is, it's an Ainu mask. It's actually from the Ainu, and it's a mask they had. So there are a lot of statues and stuff that reference this mask, and we don't know a lot about it except that it exists and that it shows up in anime and other stuff. It just represents a god. we don't know anything past that point because nobody really knows the origin of that story. The Ainu don't know themselves because the people who knew they're not around anymore. So that's kind of my experience. If people want to continue having online conventions, they should, but they should recognize what it is and what it isn't. And just going, oh, well, we're going to do everything online doesn't work. I don't think I've seen anybody before that really doing it well. E3 was going online anyway, just because nobody wanted to enjoy those lines. Really, what they should have done is they should have done a 360 video of, you know, the big, cool-looking displays at E3, and then shown videos of people playing the games, and maybe have some online demos for people to enjoy. And that would be it. The game, the convention itself really has these things going on. And I gotta admit, I've attended the PAX one, I've attended the online academic one, I've attended big, I've attended small, I've attended medium-sized, and LTUE really were the first people that really got it. And it felt like an actual event. And that's the trick about these kinds of ideas, is you're not trying to make people understand things. You're trying to make an event for people to enjoy. So, if you have the Northwest Pinball and Arcade Show, the major reason to go to this show is the arcade games. If you can't have people playing arcade games, then you shouldn't have the show. And that hurts because I absolutely adore the Northwest Pinball and Arcade Show. I adore the absolutely amazing Portland Retro Gaming Expo. But if you can't make it worth the time, if you can't make that feel like a place for people to gather, then you shouldn't have it. You shouldn't do it. And that's pretty much what I gathered. LTUE, they gathered people, they promoted it. All the people watching had commentary. We were able to interact with each other. There was a lot of hangouts. I think one of the cooler things is they had an entire channel dedicated to filking, which is people playing music based on fantasy stuff. And that's a very simplified answer. Joe Ficklin could tell you better because he's majorly into it. He was there actually. So that's pretty much what I learned from that. What I also noticed was, it was a lot easier. I didn't have to drive to Utah. I could do a lot of stuff. I was basically home. If I wanted to, in certain points, I could have gone to work. That isn't, of course, a good thing, if I were being honest, because, how do I say this correctly? Not everything works. If I really didn't feel it was going to be an event until it was actually an event. So, there's still work to be done. There are still some fixes to be made. I got kicked off the server a couple times just because it happened. So, I enjoyed it, and I think that's kind of the basis everybody should be using, but I don't know if everybody can use it, if you know what I mean. So, yeah, there's a lot of different opinions, different ideas. It wasn't perfect, but it was exactly what was needed. And I don't know how to take, say, an arcade show or a classic video game show or a video game show in general and show people how to do these things. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matter, my experience. I just sat on my butt, had a good angle, and enjoyed it. The coolest thing I could admit to is a lot of people thought there were books behind me. So they were like, oh, he's trying to show off. And I confessed to the game designers, actually, these are video games. All my books are in storage right now. So that was my day. or that was the event. So what are your opinions? What are your ideas? How should conventions move forward? I'd love to hear your ideas, your thoughts on the matter. Hopefully my audio is better this time. I apologize for all the static. I'm doing what I can, but there's only so much I can do. So catch y'all later, and have a good one.